Welcome back to our study of the Bodhisattva Guide, known as the Dalai Lama's commentary, a summary really of Shantideva's Bodhicharya Avatara, the way of the Bodhisattva. And yeah, with the recommencing here, I guess I realized actually we really should send out reminder emails about the when we begin after a break. And I did send an email out in December, which had the link for registration here. But anyway, I think it would be good probably if in the future we send out reminders just before the program itself actually recommences. So we'll try to do that in the future. Anyway, it's wonderful that you're here. And as always, we begin with what we call preparation with bodhicitta jorwa senke, which means that we bring to this study this vast appreciation of its value in terms of remedying the universal cause of suffering. So with that, we then will look at the 8th chapter of the Way of the Bodhisattva, which is the chapter on meditation. So we're presently, in terms of developing bodhicitta, we would say the first 3 chapters, they really are about identifying bodhicitta, giving rise to it, then making sure that it becomes stable, and then increasing it. And we're presently in the last 3 chapters, the chapters 7, 8, and 9, where this is about increasing bodhicitta. And we do this particularly then through the practice of meditation. And in the Way of the Bodhisattva, there's of course the reference to availing oneself of the unique situation of the human life, where we could leave behind all the ordinary concerns and focus one-pointedly on the objective, the most valuable objective there ever could be, which is eliminating the cause of suffering. Doing so through our own personal journey, then being able to alleviate and guide others in order that they also may alleviate the cause of suffering. And the way to do that is practicing one-pointedly in solitudes. And this, of course, comes from culture. The culture of India in general accommodates this great vision of what really matters. And as such, you could say very sophisticated culture. Whereas in our culture, we're a little bit fixated on what doesn't matter that much, which are all the things that gratify our habitual demands in this life, our habitual craving, which of course is understandable, it's normal, and we're surrounded by persons who subscribe to that. But if we have if we think out of the box of modernity and we really think what really matters and understand what causes suffering, what brings about happiness, then we can appreciate why the great cultures like the Indian cultures, the Tibetan, Chinese, Japanese, what have you, Cambodian, Laotian, Thai, Sri Lankan, and other cultures as well, why they prioritized this project of eliminating ignorance, fundamental ignorance, as they did, and why there was this cultural context in which this was accommodated, where there were viharas, retreats, monasteries, and so forth, in which people really could focus. And this was never done with the intention to ultimately get away from others or from the world, but it was about really providing the necessary conditions for succeeding in this project of study and meditation. Particularly meditation then in this chapter here is associated with going to woodlands and glens and isolated places. But us then in the reality of the modern culture, we don't have that, you could say, cultural heritage of this understanding, this vision. And so we need to be realistic and simply just adapt according to the present situation. So meditation for us would probably mean that we have a time and a place in which we can regularly then focus on the practice of meditation. It can be our room, it can be a corner in the living room, it can be somewhere where we have a place where there is the necessary conditions to actually sit and sit properly. And then we need to do that with some regularity. So practicing meditation to the best of our abilities then is really essential for our cultivation of bodhicitta. Now I'm just going to go through just a few of the root verses, just to sort of summarize, to get us back into, you could say, the groove with regards to the subject matter. And so here are some of the verses. I just quickly copy and pasted it from the Kindle, so you'll apologize. They're not exactly formatted as verse. So you can probably see the way that it's set up here. This should have been in verse. But anyway, the meaning should hopefully be intact. And I'd just like to just go over this very briefly before we continue where we left off. So verse 1 here from Shantideva reads, cultivating diligence, as just described, meaning in chapter 7, in concentration I will place my mind. For those whose minds are slack and wandering, are caught between the fangs of the afflictions. So the issue here is what we mean to address with meditation is actually becoming present and putting an end really to the mind that's just not present. It's wandering, it's slack, it's just not really doing what it potentially could be doing. And that's where we get caught up in the various afflictions. Verse 3 then reads, because of loved ones and desire for gain, we fail to turn away from worldly things. These then are the first things to renounce. The prudent should conduct themselves like this. So our concern and our entanglement in ordinary considerations, they distract us. This doesn't mean that we should leave our family, our spouse, our responsibilities, but it really just means that our mind needs to be turned to what really matters rather than getting caught up with habitual ways of engaging with the world. And of course, the point here really is that we can engage much better with the ones we love. We can achieve much better what it is that we wish to achieve if our mind is not distracted, carried away, and particularly if it's continually centered around simply just our own narrow benefit. Penetrative insight, meaning vipassana, joined with calm abiding, meaning shamatha, utterly eradicates afflicted states. Knowing this, first search for calm abiding, found by people who are happy to be free from worldly ties. So we need to join the vipassana with actual sitting, with actual calm abiding. We can't just say, oh, I'm just going to rest in the nature of mind wherever I go. And that's very nice. And of course, there's no reason why we couldn't do it, except the facts are that we are distracted. And taking that realistically into, you could say, account, then we need to have this foundation of sitting. We need to, right up to the very end of the path, everybody sits. Rinpoche Rinpoche used to sit a lot. Other great masters sit a lot. Sitting is essential. If I crave for other beings, a veil is cast upon the perfect truth. Wholesome disillusion melts away, and finally comes the sting of pain. So this is again the familiar fact that if we still are caught wishing for, oh, if only I had my friends, if only I had my family, if only I have the ones that make me feel good, the ones that I think they love me and I love them, and so forth. If we keep craving for this, we're never going to be actually able to really help them. We're just stuck in our own craving. And so Shantideva here says, if I crave for other beings, a veil is cast upon the perfect truth. Wholesome disillusion melts away, and finally comes the sting of pain. So ultimately, pursuing these habitual cravings, they not only fail in their objective, but we also aren't able to serve others. If we truly do love others, then we focus on the perfect truth. So that's where this wholesome disillusion is essential. And if we get caught up in the craving, then this disillusion melts away. My thoughts are all for them, and thus my life is frittered by. My family and friends all change and pass, for whom the changeless Dharma is cast out. Same thing again, just being preoccupied about those that we label the ones that we love and desire and so forth. Our life is wasted, and we never are able to do anything for these people that anyway are going to pass. We're never going to be able to stay with. And so as such, then what really actually would benefit ourselves and others is cast out. So then again, referring to what I was saying earlier about in the cultures of where the vision of you could say wisdom and so on was prevalent, then the culture and the practice was there to actually go to remote locations. Of course, we don't have that so much nowadays, but nevertheless, we can still appreciate why this culture exists, why this practice of going to remote locations exists. We can so appreciate the incredible value of such locations. And even if we don't have that, then focusing on practicing where we are within our particular given conditions realistically, then also we set up some boundaries in which we can achieve the same, say, goal. So Shantideva writes, in woodlands, haunt of stag and bird, among the trees where no dissension jars, it's there I should keep pleasant company. When might I be off to make my dwelling there? So this is where we understand the value of this, and we should be, we could say, keen and with urgency. We should head for such a place. So if we're living in a city and we don't have that situation, then we really just to have that yearning to have moments where we sit down and we actually cultivate calm and insight. Shantideva then says, when shall I depart to make my home? In cave or empty shrine or under spreading tree, with in my breast a free, unfettered heart, which never turns to cast a backward glance. So in undertaking that, we don't look back. And then generating the things, generating determination to persevere in this, Shantideva then very realistically addresses what it is that can get in the way. So there's not sort of a notion that once you're out in there and you're just going to be forever in bliss, once you're meditating and so forth. That's the sort of the urban myth about the spiritual path. You turn onto the spiritual path and then everything is love and light. Well, not. There's the predictable habitual patterns that sneak in, and that's where we're going to be yearning for others, and particularly then yearning for others as romantic companions or persons who give us safety, who fill out our loneliness and so forth. And that's where we need to, again, be realistic. And that's where we contemplate that these short moments that we call a human life, they don't last. Shantideva writes, when you saw the heaps of human bones, you felt revulsion in the charnel ground. And will you take delight in cities of the dead frequented by such skeletons that live and move? So while we think of others as these persons that sort of delight us or we hope would delight us and so on, in fact, we're all dying. We're all on our way to dying, and it's just a matter of a few moments before we will be no different from those beings in the charnel ground. Shantideva then says, the pain of gaining, keeping, and of losing all. See the endless hardships brought on us by property. For those distracted by their love of wealth, there is no chance for freedom from the sorrows of existence. And again, hoarding money, hoarding possessions of various kinds, we can see how much distraction, how much trouble this causes, and how much this occupies the mind. Again, this is where we need to free ourselves from this, be aware of the pitfalls in that. And even it doesn't mean that we shouldn't pay taxes or look after our property, but it just means that we should be aware of the nature of this distraction and not let it dominate. Shantideva says, all that we desire is sure to perish, on which account we fall to hellish pain. For what amounts to very little, we must suffer constant and exhausting weariness. So again, entangled and dominated by what in fact doesn't have much ultimate purpose, we exhaust ourselves. This we need to recognize. He says, with but a millionth part of such vexation, enlightenment itself could be attained. Those who crave are plagued far more than those engaged upon the path. Yet Buddhahood is not what they attain. So again, with our entanglement and everything that really doesn't amount to much, we spend so much energy. And if we had put that energy to enlightenment, it would be attained. So we can see how those who pursue the worldly path, how they suffer, and yet if they were to put their energy into the path, they could be free, they could have happiness, and they could serve others. They could bring about happiness in the lives of others. So that is then the objective of the Bodhisattva, is then to bring about happiness to those that we are connected with, all sentient beings. Now, so then get back to the text here, then picking up a little bit before where we ended last time, just because this is on a very personal note from the Dalai Lama. And last time he was saying about, people perceive him in particular ways, and he was just being very candid about what it is that people might perceive as being wonderful about him. His Holiness says, when people say that I have worked a lot for peace, I feel embarrassed. I feel like laughing. I don't think that I have done very much for world peace. It's just that my practice is the peaceful path of kindness, love, compassion, and not harming others. This has become part of me. It's not something for which I have specially volunteered. I am simply a follower of the Buddha, and the Buddha taught that patience is the supreme means for transcending suffering. He said, if a monk harms others, he is not a monk. I am a Buddhist monk, so I try to practice accordingly. When people think this practice is something unique and special and call me a leader of world peace, I feel almost ashamed. A good heart is the source of all happiness and joy, and we can all be good-hearted if we make an effort. But better still is to have bodhicitta, which is a good heart imbued with wisdom. It is the strong desire to attain enlightenment in order to deliver all beings from suffering and bring them to Buddhahood. This thought of helping others is rooted in compassion, which grows from a feeling of gratitude and love for beings who are afflicted by suffering. So we have this dual theme that's running throughout whatever we're doing here, really, which is, on one hand, caring for sentient beings, but on the other hand, also being wise, having wisdom, knowing what's real and not being naive. And that's where we can see sentient beings in their naivete. That's where they bring about their own suffering. Us wishing to benefit them is not just that we're going to go out and sort of throw a net of love over everyone and then, be there with them, that kind of sort of sticky love. It's the wish really to do what will help them. Just like with children, we don't just spoil children, but we teach them how to effectively manage the world. And so this is what the Bodhisattva has. And so we have this not just the good heart, but also having bodhicitta, which is this unity of wisdom with this unity of compassion with wisdom. So how do we do this? So His Holiness says, traditionally there are two methods for developing this sort of care and gratitude. One is to reflect on the fact that all beings have at some time in the succession of their lives been our parents, or at least close friends, so that we naturally feel grateful to them and wish to take on their suffering in exchange for our happiness. And this is where we don't relate to the world as something that we'd like something from. I want the world to give me this, or I want the world to give me that. That's never going to happen. There's a world of sentient beings that are suffering. And they suffer even though they want to be happy, they suffer. And this is what should be our concern. And that's where we should look to them and reflect. At one point or another, we have been connected in countless ways. We traditionally, in the Mahayana teaching, think of all sentient beings as having been our parents. Then again, we might have issues with our parents. So like Dingo would say, then see all sentient beings as having been your children at one point. And just like you feel care for your children in this life, then think about all sentient beings in the same way. So that's where we feel love for them. But there should be this sense of gratitude that all sentient beings, they have gone out of their way in infinite ways. And so our relationship to them is one of caring and also particularly one of gratitude. So that's, His Holiness says there's two methods. So this was the first. He says then the other method is to understand that others suffer in the same way as we do, to see that we all are equal and to reflect on what is wrong with egotism and on the advantages of altruism. We can use whichever of these two methods suits us best or practice them both together. So the first is this gratitude towards sentient beings, and the other is seeing we're all equal. There's no one who doesn't want exactly what we want as well. But we can see when we get caught up in just focusing on our particular issues and failing to understand and equate ourselves with others, then that's where we bring about the same suffering that we see other sentient beings are suffering from. So that's where we talk about egotism versus altruism, self-centering versus selflessness. It's also important to understand when we say egotism, it's not as if we are bad persons. We're just distracted. We're slightly confused. And that's where all of a sudden we get caught up in something that is essentially delusional. It's the whole drama around me. If we just would breathe and allow space and calm, then this grip, this sort of panicky grip we have on the whole issue of me, would sort of relax. So egotism is not as if it's something we're burdened with, we're born with ego or whatever. Yes, ego drives samsara. But the thing is, and what's the whole point here of the Dharma and the path is that we could very well let go of that because it has no reality ultimately. It's just in moments of confusion that we fixate on this, something which actually doesn't exist. So that's where us thinking altruism versus egotism is not a moralistic issue where we battle against ourselves. It's a matter of just us relaxing and all of a sudden clearly seeing that we have a condition that we needn't be caught up with. And within that space, there's also an awareness of others. So there's naturally this expanding outward and embracing others, which is not just about our sentimentality or our needs, but really coming from a place of insight. So His Holiness says in either case, it's necessary first to understand what we call suffering. It is easy enough for us to feel compassion for people who are starving, in pain, or in great distress, and for animals who are maltreated. But when we think of human and celestial beings who are very happy, we tend to feel envious. This is because we have not really understood what suffering is and that all beings suffer. So we can look to those that live sort of in the Hollywood hills of samsara and think, oh, they're so fortunate. They have wealth, they have security, they have friends, they're loved, they're recognized, and so forth. But the truth is, all of these beings they are equally the cause of compassion, or the object of compassion, as people that we see in nations and locations where there's incredible starvation and where there's incredible stress and so forth. So there's equally suffering everywhere. As long as there still is this fundamental condition of delusion, then there's suffering. So His Holiness says, apart from the most obvious torments of suffering added to suffering and suffering of change, there is all-pervading suffering. So this is famously the three kinds of suffering. The first two are conspicuous. They're sort of the suffering added to suffering. That's very conspicuous. That's when everything goes wrong and we're in pain. The other is that even if we have it good, this changes. We might have it good right now, but it won't last. Others might have it good, but it won't last. This is the nature of basically the condition of delusion, in which there's a sense of self that likes some things and doesn't like other things. And when we have what we like, the trouble is it doesn't last. It's like anything that's compounded, it's impermanent. So the first two, they're fairly easy to see. The last one is the subtle one. That is all-pervading suffering. That is where there's the fundamental delusion of self. And that doesn't matter if we're a God abiding in the great bliss of the highest samadhi, or if we're an ordinary sentient being. There's all the time this basic condition of delusion that inevitably brings about suffering. So the footnote here says, the three sufferings are as follows. 1, suffering added to suffering is what all beings can perceive as undesirable and painful. In samsara, suffering follows each other in endless succession. For example, when one is stricken with illness, one succumbs to another malady, or the loss of all one's possessions is followed by one's house being burnt down. Second, suffering of change refers to the fact that any happiness and pleasure in samsara is bound to change sooner or later into a state of suffering. For example, the gustative pleasure experienced during a delicious meal may give way to the discomfort of indigestion. And then finally, all-pervading suffering has been defined as suffering resulting from the fact of having the 5 skandhas or aggregates. As long as one takes conditioned existence in samsara, as long as one takes one takes rebirth in samsara, there is suffering. Most ordinary beings are unable to perceive this clearly, just as one might not feel a hair on the palm of one's hand. But in the same way as a hair in the eye causes irritation and pain, realized beings experience this all-pervading suffering acutely. So if you look in the jewel ornament, which originally was translated by Herman Gunther, you can see the same thing. This is mentioned in one of the early chapters. So, and also in the words of my perfect teacher. So for anybody who's just somewhat sensitive, there is this, what the Germans call Weltschmerz, or existential angst, and the fundamental just something's not quite right. And so even though everything's hunky-dory, there's still this tinge of existential dissatisfaction. And that's inherent to the condition of us simply just being out of whack. We're just not aligned and in touch. And this is the all-pervading suffering. So His Holiness comments, because of the latter, as long as we are in samsara, we can never have lasting happiness. Once we have reflected on and understood this for ourselves, we can apply this understanding to others. Then we start to feel compassion and think, I must free all these beings from suffering. So first we can see there's this thing that we are subjecting ourselves to. We're not bad persons, but we're just innocently caught in confusion. And we can address this. And then we begin to be aware that it's not just that we are here on our own. There's others as well. So that's where this awareness brings about the determination to wishing to free others. So then His Holiness comments, however, to actually do so, we have to change our approach to this life into our future lives. First, we must reflect on impermanence on the certainty of our own death and on the fact that we can never know how soon we might die. So two things are certain. We will die. Oh, sorry, yeah, certain that we will die, and it's also certain that we don't know when this will come. Then someone says, after death, we will not simply vanish. The positive or negative actions we have done will determine how we are reborn. Our negative actions might cause us to be reborn in the lower realms, for example, as animals exploited, maltreated, and butchered by humans or devoured by other animals. So again, this is not something that's common in our culture. And very often, some of the most brilliant people in our culture, they seem to be determined to roll out this completely unsubstantiated and very poorly and very, you could say scientifically profoundly flawed, actually, assumption that consciousness, which is entirely immaterial, entirely something that's intangible, that might be like other phenomena, something that just comes and goes, just like if something breaks and then we can say it's no longer there. If the table falls apart, we can say there's no more table. That kind of dogma that permeates the modern landscape, in which we are sort of hit with through every aspect of our arts, literature, and in general cultural discourse, that, you know, after this life, well, there's nothing there, kids, sorry. You know, that is such a pervasive dogma that for us, when we come across this, we might have sort of taken refuge in the Buddhist teaching and so on. But we're surrounded by a very dominant discourse saying the exact opposite. So that's where we need to really think hard about this and really understand what we mean with the nature of consciousness. And that's where we can't rely on a science that really, by its own admission, clearly sees consciousness as a bit of a problem that hasn't really been understood. The hard problem of science. And it would probably make sense if we listen to the science in which consciousness is understood. And that is the scope of the Buddhist teaching. And we should also not sort of accept the Buddhist teaching blindly. That's not what the Buddha is encouraging us ever to do. But then, following the Buddha's leads, analyze, try and see, does consciousness, does it have something about it that comes apart and can be undone? Does consciousness have the nature of anything? And the assumption that the consciousness is something that's created by neurobiological systems, the brain and what have you, is that really substantiated through what we know really is the sort of the general fact throughout the natural world, that phenomena exist on the basis of cause and effect, but the cause necessarily, you could say, affects the effect. And so the result of something necessarily needs to come about through a cause that resembles it, just like an apple tree comes about through an apple seed. And that's why we can see phenomena that do not have consciousness can't really be said to give rise to consciousness. So the idea of consciousness originating from a brain, from, you say, biological systems, is a profoundly naive and flawed assumption, and yet it's so pervasive. So that's where we need to say, you could say these people, they can do something. They're very good at you know, all sorts of profoundly impressive technologies. But when it comes to consciousness, that's not really their domain. And that's where we need to recognize then that what is going to happen when we pass away is that consciousness is going to continue like it has always done, creating various experiences. And that's where we talk about, as long as we're held within this condition in which these three aspects of suffering, they apply, then we could very easily be reborn in realms in which there's a lot of suffering. And not just thinking for ourselves, but also understanding this is the case for others as well. So to be proactive in this context, not just to say, oh, woe is I, this is all terrible. The point really here is that there's something that can be done. His Holiness says to free ourselves from the ocean of suffering, we should begin to study and practice the path of liberation. We might hope to see some results after a few years, but speaking realistically, we should plan on probably having to continue our practice over many lives to come. In each of these lives, we're going to need a proper support for practice, namely a human body, without which it will be impossible to make progress. The first stage on the path, therefore, is to ensure a good human rebirth. So although our final aim is to achieve enlightenment for all beings, we have to begin the path by following the discipline of avoiding the 10 non-virtuous actions and practicing the 10 virtuous actions. So again, this all comes down to us being proactive. We can't just sign up in the Buddhist church and then everything's going to be hunky-dory. We're signing up in an, you could say, an educational process in which we're going to have to do our homework. We're going to have to apply ourselves. And in that this is something that has to do with the very nature of what we experience every moment of our existence. We have to align the Dharma with our mind at every moment. There's never a time where we're unconscious. There's always this presence of our mind. So it's this mind that we need to work with. So that's where other issues that we attend to, they're sort of there for a short moment. We attend to our car, we attend to our house, we attend to our friends and so on. They can be attended to, but the mind, that's always there. So His Holiness says, to summarize, we start by getting rid of our attachment to non-spiritual goals, first in this life and then in future lives. Having seen the suffering inherent in samsara, we resolve to free ourselves. And as we extend this attitude to other beings, we develop compassion and generate bodhicitta. We have to go through these stages of training the mind in the right order, like going up some stairs or like building a foundation before we build a wall. If we follow the path gradually in this way, the result will have to be stable. But if we simply say, for the sake of all beings, however strong our wish to help beings might be at that moment, it will not be stable unless it's well founded on the correct practices of the earlier stages. So this means first clearly understanding a view, clearly understanding the map, where it is we're going, what it is that we're doing, and then creating the actual foundations, which is calming the mind and gradually beginning to have some trust in the basic goodness that's innate to ourselves and others. And that's where we then can come to a place where we develop bodhicitta, wishing to serve other sentient beings. In the beginning, His Holiness says, we should have a clear overall view of the path so that we know what we are aiming at in our practice and can recognize the level we have reached. Then, as we practice regularly, we may experience profound changes in our minds. But these experiences only occur when we are concentrating in sessions of meditation. Later, after meditating for a long time, we find these experiences occur spontaneously when we encounter particular circumstances without our needing to concentrate in meditation. So great meditators, they will have the spiritual experiences, the sort of the relaxed state of spaciousness and so on, even when they are busy and even when they are running into particular circumstances. If they run into good circumstances, they don't get overly excited about that. They simply enjoy it. If they run into difficult circumstances, they don't react, but simply deal with the particular circumstances. So that's where the foundation for such, you could say, a disposition, that is that there first has to be a ground of understanding, and then there has to be a ground that's effective or cultivated through practicing meditation in sessions. His Holiness then says, take the example of bodhicitta. After we have meditated on bodhicitta for a while, a change occurs in our minds, but only when we are actually thinking of bodhicitta. This is what is called fabricated experience. It is not the bodhicitta of a real bodhisattva. As we maintain progress, however, we reach a point where the mere sight of an animal or bird causes the thought to well up from the depth of our heart. when will I ever attain enlightenment? When will I ever attain enlightenment for this being? This is what we call a natural experience. And at this point, true bodhicitta has taken root in us. We can generally call ourselves practitioners of Mahayana. Sorry, we can genuinely call ourselves practitioners of Mahayana and are then on the lesser path of accumulation. So this is at the very beginning of the path. Proceeding on the middle path of accumulation, we begin the greater path of accumulation of merit, which lasts 3 uncountable kalpas. This is followed by the path of connection with its 4 stages of warmth, climax, endurance, and supreme realization. Then, as we start on the path of seeing, we gain the wisdom of the first Bodhisattva level. In this way, we gradually traverse the 5 paths and 10 levels and ultimately attain Buddhahood. So this is then what we refer to as the 5 paths and the 10 levels. Yeah. So this means, and this of course is where, again, if we've been exposed to Vajrayana teaching, then we are still practicing a gradual path, but there is in Vajrayana then the notion that we could achieve enlightenment a lot quicker. And that's because the Vajrayana path is premised on recognizing the unconditional pure ground as already spontaneously present within ourselves. But that doesn't mean that the foundations and you could say the overall nature of the gradual path doesn't apply to the Vajrayanists. It's just that the premise for the path is a different perspective on ourselves. We no longer see, or rather Vajrayana is premised on the recognition that enlightenment is already there. Whereas in the gradual path we're talking about here, we take into account that we are presently an ordinary sentient being. And so as much as we have Buddha nature, then presently this is veiled. And so over a long time, working with the ordinary mind, then we gradually proceed along the five paths that's described here. In the Vajrayana notion of who we are, there is then the vision that we are not a sentient being. We are essentially a Buddha, only temporarily veiled. So of course, in practice, we need to combine these two, and that's you could say, the very pragmatic nature of the Buddhist heritage that we receive in the Tibetan tradition, is this unity of understanding how these two approaches, they combine, they work together. So we should have this humble recognition of being a sentient being, practicing the path of the sutras, the gradual path that's described here, and also possibly then having access to the particular privileged path of the Vajrayana. But we need to have a clear understanding of how they actually both function and how they actually work together. So presently within the general Mahayana, we very much work with this notion of the gradual path as being something that, where we gradually eliminate the dualistic cognitive obscuration over a very long time. His Holiness says then in regard to these paths, he says, these paths and level are therefore related to our own inner transformation through the practice of bodhicitta. Okay. Let's see if there's any questions. Wow, no questions. Okay. All right, if there's no questions, I'll keep going a little bit. Then it says here, strive at first to meditate upon the sameness of yourself and others. In joy and sorrow, all are equal. Thus be a guardian of all, as of yourself. So this is important. This is where we don't just all of a sudden think, oh, we're all the same. That doesn't happen. We have to meditate. Meditate means that we again and again recognize this. We familiarize ourselves with this perspective. And that's where we understand we share this condition of experiencing joy and sorrow. So that's where we have this sympathy for others. But we need to begin with ourselves. Thus be a guardian as of yourself, of all, as just be a guardian of all as of yourself. So it's not like everybody all of a sudden are going to be bodhisattvas along with us. It's us who actually have to see ourselves as the ones that look after others, like a parent, like a mother who cares for others and doesn't really have too much concern for herself. So that's likewise also then we should be like this with regards to all sentient beings. They all have exactly the same conditions of joy and sorrow as we do. His Holiness says, in what way are others equal to us? Just like us, they naturally want to be happy and to avoid suffering. Although on analysis, we're unable to find an I that truly exists, we are still convinced that it does exist, and we therefore consider that we have a right to be happy and a right to escape happiness. But this is also the case for other beings, so there's no particular reason why we should be any more important than them. Why should we accomplish only our own happiness and not be responsible for others' happiness? Why should we make an effort to avoid suffering for ourselves and not be responsible for doing the same for others? And we should take into consideration also that we presently have a vision and an understanding and a perspective that others actually don't have. We have a luxury or an advantage. So that's where even more so we should really be motivated to look after others. His Holiness says, when we try to protect our bodies, we also protect the parts of the body, such as our hands and feet. Similarly, since the happiness and suffering of others are all part of the same happiness and suffering that is ours, we must protect others from suffering just as much as we protect ourselves and strive for others' happiness just as we do for our own. So when we're protecting ourselves, that means we're protecting all parts of our body. So looking after happiness, then also the happiness of others. They are, basically you could say, others are us. Our own sufferings, though not felt by others, are certainly hard for us to bear. So it's natural we should try to protect ourselves from suffering. Similarly, others' pain, even if we do not feel it, is no less unbearable for them. So again, equal. But as we are related to all other beings, we owe them our gratitude and they help us in our practice. But as we are related to all other beings, as we owe them our gratitude and they help us in our practice, let us try to dispel their suffering as well as ours. So we care about how others are suffering. We have this thing we looked at earlier, this gratitude. They have done so much for us. And also, they, just like us, they're suffering, even though they can't feel our suffering and we can't feel their suffering. We can very well logically infer that they are suffering as much as we are. So there's every reason for us to really be determined to dispel the suffering of others. His Holiness says all beings equally want to be happy. So why should we be the only ones to get happiness? Why should we be protected from suffering and others not be? So Shantideva says, and therefore I'll dispel the pain of others, for it is simply pain, just like my own, and others I will aid and benefit, for they are living beings, like my body. So this is like we looked at previously. Just like we look after all parts of our body, we should look after others. Their pain is our pain. Since the pain of others does no harm to me, I should not shield myself from it. So why to guard against my future pain, which does no harm this present me? Now this is Shantideva's style, by the way. He takes the we could call it the devil's advocate, right? He takes the opposition view. Says, well, the others, doesn't harm me. I'm okay. Others might suffer. I'm actually all right. So why should I worry about that? And also, yes, I might create some bad karma for the future, but you know, that doesn't actually harm me right now. So that's a little bit sort of the you know, fly now, pay later attitude that that we don't really worry about the consequences of our actions. You know, the issue is my future pain. Well, I'm not feeling it right now. You know, in Danish we say "den tid, den sorg." It means, oh yeah, come that time, then that'll be the problem. But basically, I don't care right now. So it's all his comments. One might think that one has to protect oneself from future suffering, because the I that suffers now and the I that will suffer in the future are the same. One might think that one has to protect oneself from future suffering. This is wrong, because what we think of as I is a succession of instants in a continuum of consciousness, and the I of the moment that will suffer in future is different from the I of the present. Okay, that's a different perspective. Since the pain of others does no harm to me, I do not shield myself from it. So why to regard my future pain, which does not harm? This is a bit more deeper than I thought. Sorry, there's more to this than met my eye. Since the pain of others does no harm to me, I do not shield myself from it. So why to guard against my future pain, which does no harm to this my present one? Hey, let me have a look at the commentary. I'll have a look at the commentary and just sit with this a little bit, so I'll be able to make a more informed commentary on it. So let's see here. So we'll start there next time. Doesn't mean what I just said isn't valid, but that Shantideva is making a different point, I think, than the point I was mistakenly making here. Yeah, we're in summertime here in Australia. Sorry about that. I've been thinking for some time how powerful the idea of all beings' form of display is. In our shamatha, would it not be better to view thoughts, emotions, and sensations as just display? Giving them more specific labels seems to simply reinforce that they are ours, as my thoughts, my emotions, and such. Yes, that's actually basic to when we talk about shamatha practice, particularly as it's taught in the Tibetan tradition. Then we actually don't sit down and analyze our thoughts. We simply just, whatever thoughts arise, we really, like in Chögyam Trungpa's way of teaching, then we would just say, whatever thoughts arise, we just label it thinking. You know, so that's the same as calling it display or whatever. And that's where no thoughts have this role of being particular VIPs, like there's particular thoughts here that they sort of attain authority. And this is very important, because this is where we begin to free ourselves from getting stuck on thoughts. So thoughts arise, and what happens with us is we get stuck on them. And then we begin to regurgitate these sort of loop narratives where we think the same thought over and over again. So that's what normally happens. So when we are practicing shamatha, this is where we become present. And as much as thoughts arise, we don't stick onto them. We allow them to be there. And that way we never actually lose our connection. Whereas when we get stuck on thoughts, we lose our connection. We're no longer really here. We're no longer present. We're lost in thought, so to speak. So that's where, regardless of whatever thoughts arise, meditation practice is that place where we actually stay connected to where we are, to space, to reality. And that's where we stay connected also to our own clarity, sanity. And we don't perpetuate this drama of me. Whereas when we begin to get stuck onto one thought, this perpetuates this strong drama of me and my, situation. So that's where it doesn't help to have just Buddhist theory in which there's all sorts of wonderful things that are being said, because all those wonderful things, they're all premised on us actually connecting, whereas the reality is we stay disconnected from reality. So for us to actually make sense of what the Buddhist teaching speaks about, we need to stay connected, and that is what we do with shamatha practice. This is where we discontinue our ordinary practice of getting lost in thought, getting caught up in these loops of narratives that run us over and over again in our mind. So that's where, regardless of whether we're approaching meditation from a foundational point of view, simply labeling everything as just thoughts, or whether we're coming from a point of view of Dzogchen or Mahamudra and seeing everything as being display, the bottom line is that we're allowing ourselves to actually stay connected without being sucked in by these sticky loop narratives that we have. We stay free of ruminations. Yeah. So you're right, giving them specific labels. This is where we label the thoughts. Yeah, this is a big issue, or this is a very interesting thought. And we can see also, we can see ourselves when we realize that we've been lost in thought. We're actually sort of like stuck in our own regurgitation, our own ruminations. Yeah, normally if there was a few minutes left, I would continue the text, but I actually have to go back and look at the text that we were just reading, realizing that I didn't quite get it. So we'll have to just leave it where we are right now. If you have no further questions, we could make it an early day. Yeah. Someone has to fly. Okay. Do fly. Okay. We'll do the dedication then. Let's see. Yeah. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen, may it never fail, but grow and flourish ever more and more. Through all our births, wherever we may be born, may we be endowed with the 7 good qualities of the higher realms. As soon as we're born, may we meet with the Dharma and have the freedom to practice it properly. At that time, may we please the holy gurus and practice the Dharma throughout the day and night. Realizing the Dharma and accomplishing its essential meaning, may we cross the ocean of existence in that life. Thoroughly teaching the holy Dharma in this world, may we never tire of accomplishing the benefit of others. By this vast benefit of others, without partiality or bias, may all attain Buddhahood together. Thank you.